Aldershot is famous as the home of the British Army, and the early character of the town was formed by the choice of the Army making Aldershot the site of its first permanent training camp. Before 1850, Aldershot was a small rural village of about 870 people. However, this underwent a dramatic change when some 15,000 soldiers arrived. The largest memorial in Aldershot is the Great Wellington statue by Matthew Coles, sited on Round Hill adjacent to the Royal Garrison Church of All Saints. This large equestrian statue was originally erected in London in 1846 and was moved to Aldershot in 1885. The statue of the Duke of Wellington was described by the Prince of Wales as being a statue of Britain's greatest soldier. At 28 feet high and weighing 40 tons, it is still the largest equestrian statue in the country and a symbol of Aldershot's military heritage.
Aldershot became the home of the British Army in the 1850s when the Army was looking to have a permanent training camp where it could gather large numbers of troops together and conduct large-scale exercises, which before that time had not been possible. So they surveyed the area in 1853 and 1854, bought the land in 1854, and the first camps were built here in 1855. These were initially wooden camps, but in between 1856 and 1859, they built some permanent barracks along the southern edge of the camp as a statement that the Army was here to stay in Aldershot. The wooden huts themselves remained until the 1890s, when the Victorians swept away all the wooden huts and built the brick barracks, the permanent brick barracks, across both north and south camps, and also expanded the camp. At this time, it had around 17,000 soldiers stationed in Aldershot Garrison, making this easily the biggest single garrison in the country. So by the time of the First World War, Aldershot had 2 infantry divisions, a cavalry brigade, artillery, support services like engineers and service corps, which made it the only de facto standing corps headquarters. So when the First World War erupted, Aldershot was priority for mobilization, and the troops from Aldershot became the first corps of the British Expeditionary Force that went off to the First World War.
The presence of the British Army in Aldershot attracted the local civilians to offer their services, knowledge, expertise, and skills to the Army.
So Patrick Alexander originally owned the telescope and used it down in Mitchett, a little village not far from here. And as I say, when it became a bit of an encumbrance, he persuaded the army to take it on for him with a view to showing army officers how to use the telescope to learn to stellar navigate at night.
The Army made of the observatory since 1906, when it was positioned here, you mean? Well, the Army was responsible for building it, though Patrick did actually provide all the funds to provide the dome structure and the telescope itself.
The Army probably didn't make best use of the telescope, but it's been a scientific monument, if you like, to the history of this town and its connections with the old flying corps back in the early days of the First World War.
Military aviation really began here in Aldershot, and it began in what was then Gibraltar Barracks, which is where Browning Barracks are today, because those were the barracks of the Royal Engineers. The first ever balloon flight, military balloon flight in Britain, took place in Aldershot in 1863. But then there was a long pause while the Army considered whether or not they wanted to use balloons. Eventually, after the American Civil War, they realized that balloons were useful for reconnaissance. And it really took off in Aldershot when they moved the balloon school and balloon factory, which had been set up in Chatham a few years before, into Gibraltar Barracks. And it was really developed in Gibraltar Barracks. The balloons began to be used on the exercises, the regular annual exercises, which showed their value. And it was from here that then balloon sections deployed to the Boer War, for example, where they were actually used in action. It was also here in Aldershot that an American, Samuel Cody, came in 1904 to demonstrate his new idea of man-lifting kites.
There is a flower within my heart, Daisy, Daisy, planted one day by a glancing dart, planted by Daisy.
He was trying to sell his man-lifting kites to the Army as a better solution for reconnaissance than balloons, especially in poor weather. And initially he demonstrated these on Queen's Parade. The Army was sufficiently impressed that they appointed Cody as chief instructor of kiting at the balloon school. He wasn't here in Aldershot too long because over that winter of 1904-1905, the balloon school moved out of Gibraltar Barracks here a few miles north to what was then Laffan's Plain in Farnborough. This was because they wanted to expand. The commander of the balloon school particularly wanted to build airships for which there was no space in Aldershot. Cody went with them. But he had no interest in airships. He saw no future in airships. He was more interested in building aeroplanes. And he had a big falling out with the colonel of the balloon school. So he left their employ. But the GOC at the time, who was General Smith-Dorrien, allowed Cody to maintain a workshop on Laffan's Plain. And it was there that he built British Army Aeroplane No. 1, and made the first ever powered flight in Britain in October 1908 on Laffan's Plain. And so with the balloon school, which morphed into the into the aircraft factory, and with Cody's pioneering work and then his successors, Farnborough became the centre for aviation development. It was the Royal Aircraft Factory until 1918, when in 1918 the Royal Flying Corps, which was the Army's flying battalion, and the Royal Naval Air Service were merged together to create the new independent service of the Royal Air Force.
This is a full-size replica of what we call British Army aeroplane number 1A. He was experimenting with kites and kite gliders. They sent Cody to France to find an engine for the airship. And it's thought while he was there, he may have seen aeroplanes flying in France.
At the same time, other areas within the British Army began to develop, such as the Physical Training Corps and sports within the military. Throughout history, sport has had a great impact on the world in many different ways. And even during the darker times of war, sport in general still manages to have a positive effect on the psychological well-being of soldiers as well as the physical training.
Physical training in the Army really began in a scientific way in Aldershot, and this was back in 1860 when Major Frederick Hammersley and 12 non-commissioned officers were sent to Oxford to do a course in gymnastics, and they came back to Aldershot and founded the Army Gymnastics Staff, as it was at that time. And this of course turned into the Army Physical Training Corps as we know it today, which is still in Aldershot and is still operating here.
The long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go.
The reason why the Corps started really goes back to the early 19th century. Back then the British Army was in great shape physically. Joining the Army, the pay was really bad, the accommodation was even worse, discipline was pretty brutal, flogging for even minor offences. Most people only joined the Army because they were quite desperate as private soldiers, and a lot of these came for this period from slum areas of the cities, so they were pretty weak physically anyway. They joined the Army, there was no physical training or anything like that. So these guys weren't in great shape, and when it came to the Crimean War in the 1850s, of the 22,000 British dead, 18 of those died from basically being physically unable to cope with their conditions. Thus after the war, there was a big scandal and the Army decided we needed a proper physical training corps.
Little girl, don't cry, I must say goodbye. Don't you hear the bugle call? And the fife and drum bid the fellows come where the flag waves over all. Though I love you so, it is time to go, and a soldier in me you'll find. When on land or sea they need boys like me, you would not have...
A lot of what they did in the early days was building upper body strength. Start off doing about 1 hour of physical training per day, the first month of training, then 2 hours per day for the next 2 months, and progressing from this little 4-pound dumbbell, well, I don't know if they all made it up to the 56-pound dumbbell, but a clear progression anyway throughout the course. So lots of that, lots of swinging Indian clubs, lots of running, lots of boxing, all to build the strength.
During the Great War, many professional and champion boxers enlisted in the armed forces. Their sporting expertise meant they often served in the Army Gymnastics Staff. Billy Wells, heavyweight champion of Great Britain, Jimmy Wilde, flyweight world champion, and Jimmy Driscoll, former featherweight world champion. The boxers and unarmed combat specialists gave demonstrations and provided practical lessons for troops, teaching men the techniques needed for hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. Boxing bouts at all organisational levels were also regularly held in operational theatres, where they were viewed as an important means of maintaining fitness and strengthening the morale of troops.
First World War was officially declared on the 4th of August 1914. In Aldershot, the GOC at the time, it was Lieutenant General Sir Douglas Haig. He was in his official residence at Government House when a telegram arrived. The telegram had a single word on it, which was mobilise, and it was signed Troopers. And Troopers was the code name for the Secretary of State for War. So Haig passed this on through the chain of command down to the units with the order to begin mobilisation. And for mobilisation, it meant that the units in Aldershot went from peacetime strength to wartime strength, so all the reservists were called back. They packed away anything that was not needed, so full dress uniforms and colours were laid away. And the men were issued with their equipment, weapons, rations that they needed. Every man was given medical examination, and the reservists, as they came back, were not only medically examined, but they went through some refresher training so that the unit was ready to mobilise. And as I say, war was declared on the 4th of August. The first units were ready on the 9th of August. By the 11th of August, they were moving out of Aldershot, ready to go to war. In 1914, August 1914, on the outbreak of the First World War, the troops in Aldershot were still living in the barracks that had been built in the Victorian era. But then they weren't that old. Most of them had been built in the 1890s, so they were only about 25 years old at the time. Aldershot, having 2 infantry divisions, having a cavalry brigade and all the supporting troops, immediately became the first corps of the British Expeditionary Force, and priority in the mobilisation plan was to get Aldershot mobilised up and out. The General Officer commanding in Aldershot at that time was General Sir Douglas Haig, so he became the commander of First Corps of the British Expeditionary Force. Aldershot, we also need to remember at this time, was not just Aldershot Garrison, it was the centre of Aldershot Command, which took in Aldershot Garrison and the camps around. So places like Borden, Purbright, Longmoor, Woking, Blackdown, Deepcut, these were all part of Aldershot Command. So in the command as a whole were something like 23,000 troops, so it was the most important command in the Home Army at this time. Immediately after the mobilisation and the regulars had moved out, of course, thousands of volunteers then came into Aldershot for training to create the new armies for the First World War.
Up to mighty London came an Irishman one day. As the streets are paved with gold, sure everyone was gay, singing songs of Piccadilly, Strand and Leicester Square, till Paddy got excited, then he shouted to them.
With the outbreak of the war, of course, thousands of troops came into Aldershot, the volunteers who responded to the Kitchener's famous recruiting corps. And so large were the numbers that the army itself could not cope within the camp. They immediately issued an order on the outbreak of war that every barracks was to increase its capacity by 50%. They also took over gymnasia, schools, libraries, anywhere they could find to accommodate the soldiers. This was not enough, so they briefly went into tents, But as winter was coming on, they couldn't obviously stay in tents. They were building wooden huts as fast as they could, but these were insufficient at the time. So they had to resort to billeting the soldiers on the civilian population. They took over schools. They took over the West End school, moved all the pupils out to the East End school so they could take over that school. They also billeted soldiers on private houses. Private individuals were asked to take a number of soldiers depending on the size of their house. So this was causing problems immediately within the camp. The accommodation crisis then got far worse because not only did you have the soldiers themselves, a lot of their families came to visit, to see them off, and then as the wounded started coming back to Aldershot to be treated in the two great military hospitals, the Cambridge and the Connaught, of course the relatives of those men also came to Aldershot to visit and be with their loved ones. Now, Aldershot did not have the accommodation to house all the visitors, and there are some terrible stories of visitors, women and their families, walking the streets of Aldershot, knocking on doors, asking if there's a bed to be had. There's also times when the police went round knocking on doors and waking up shopkeepers and asking them if they could let half a dozen people sleep on their floors. And the accommodation problem was one that continued really throughout the war and was never fully solved within the camp or the town itself.
The Cambridge Military Hospital is named after the Duke of Cambridge, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and opened in 1879. The clock tower is 109 feet high, and the dials of the clock are 8 feet in diameter. This amazing architectural building is based in the South Camp and became the first British military hospital to have a dedicated plastic surgery unit, created by the outstanding surgeon Harold Gillies.
The Cambridge Military Hospital was one of the two great hospitals, and each had its specialisation. They both took normal wounded, but the Connaught Hospital in North Camp also took the psychological cases, what at the time they called shell shock, today we know as PTSD, whereas the Cambridge became famous as having the first plastic surgery unit in any British military hospital. This was founded by Harold Gillies, who was born in New Zealand, but he went over to France, saw the work that was being done by French plastic surgeons, and realised that there was a need for this because of the horrific injuries that the soldiers were suffering in the trenches to their faces. So he persuaded the Surgeon General to allow him to set up a plastic surgery unit at the Cambridge Military Hospital, and asked for any soldiers with facial injuries to be sent to that unit. There he was assisted by William Kelsey Fry, who was a dental surgeon, so he was an expert at rebuilding jaws and mouths. So between Harold Gillies and Kelsey Fry, they could rebuild the faces of these hideously injured soldiers. This was revolutionary, and it was a huge success. With the Battle of the Somme in 1916, so many were the wounded being sent to Gillies and his plastic surgery unit that even though they doubled in size in the Cambridge, it still could not cope. So eventually it was decided to move the entire unit out to a hospital at Sidcup, where they could have a much larger hospital. And between Gillies and Kelsey Fry throughout the war, they rebuilt thousands of soldiers' faces. And after the war, Harold Gillies was knighted for his services and his pioneering work in medicine.
Before the war, but more noticeably during the Great War, the civilians played an important part in providing services, support and accommodation to the army. Gale and Polden established their printing works in Aldershot in 1893 and grew to be one of the town's largest businesses. The war instigated an extremely high demand on books and manuals. There was a disastrous fire, which occurred on Sunday afternoon on 14th July 1918 at 4:14 p.m. and totally destroyed the Grove and Birchett Road wings of Gale and Polden's printing factory. The action of the Aldershot Fire Brigade and the Army prevented the spread of fire.
Beige and from Brook Taverner, and I want.
You want
I need
the green
yeah.
as well.
My grandfather opened the doors on the 10th of March 1923. He'd been previously working for another gentleman's outfit in the time from 1910 as a young boy, and that was called Woodruff's. Our long-standing presence of Aldershot has gone back, say, from 1923, and my grandfather was always involved with the town in shows and helping down with Bruce to put on exhibitions, etc. I came into the business in, I say, 1969, and I've probably expanded that more. I go out to visit parents who can't get in. I visit the old people who again can't get in, and we do a lot to help where we can. It's just part, our little shop has become part and parcel of Aldershot. We hope to make the 100 years if we can make it, even better. This museum was started about 20 years ago now. My dear grandmother never threw anything away. She was a hoarder just like her grandson, myself. And so somebody, the local history society said, talked about it, coming to do an interview. And they said, have you got anything we can use, props and things? I said, I've got so much information, let me get something organised first. So we set to working on this, and over about a week we started up, and it's actually grown and grown and grown since then. My first relative was my grandfather, who started this business. His name was Fred Jerome. He was in the Boys Cadets, and he was in a menswear shop in Aldershot, right at the top of the town, from 1910. And the war came along, 1914, and he went in, and he ended up serving in Ireland from 1914 to 18. But in 1919, when the war ended, because he was a cavalryman, actually he was in what's called the Hampshire Carabineers. And in those days, there were soldiers who were officers or enlisted who were yeoman farmers who had their own horse, and they would come along with their own horse. But when he joined, luckily in 1914, they changed it to the cycle battalion. So instead of bringing a horse, you brought your own bike. So that was interesting. There's a picture of them all on their bikes in Farnham. And because he was a cavalryman and he'd been used to horse riding, at the end of the First World War, he got a commission, the 2nd 10th Royal Scots Regiment, and they went out to Russia in the expeditionary force against the Red Russians. But of course it didn't last very long, because they soon came back as Lenin took over very quickly. And 1919 he came back and he married my grandmother, grandfather's wife. His mother used to own a boarding house in York Road in Aldershot. And the story always goes that my grandfather's father-in-law came to Aldershot. His name was Mr. Rubik, and he was the smallest of the family. They came from Emsworth. So he wasn't strong enough to be a builder, so he was sent up to relations who had a grocer's shop. And Mrs. Jerome used to do all the cooking for the family, but it was always said that he never liked her cooking. So he left the business of Mr. Wallace and went and started his own business, Rubik's, and then he built up an emporium and he built a theatre. But we know that isn't quite true about the cooking, because my grandmother she kept her little book. There's a picture of in York Road of the little boarding house, because this is all a little booklet where soldiers used to come and sign. This goes from 1911 to 1917, and from an extract from a Lieutenant Tebbit from the RE Royal Engineers, 9th of May 1914. I've been under Mrs. Jerome's hospitality, and for the past 14 days I've had wonderful comfort and gratitude to her. The cooking was splendid. So it wasn't her cooking, and in all this book, all mentions how wonderful cooking. So I think it was just an excuse for my grandfather to go and start his own business. My grandfather's brother was a civilian surveyor for the army. The laying out of the 1894, the original finish of the building of the camp. And when he retired, they gave him an honorary colonelship. And he was the only civilian ever to have a barrack square named after him. But he was never a colonel, never in the army, but he got his own colonelship and awarded it. So.
The Royal Garrison Church is one of three current garrison churches. The Royal Garrison Church is the Anglican church. We also have the Church of St Michael and St George, which is the cathedral church for the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Forces, and we have the Garrison Church of Scotland, which is there for the Scottish Presbyterian Church. All three churches are still used as garrison churches. They have services every Sunday. And they're also used, of course, for special regimental or corps Sundays. And the Royal Garrison Church is also the centre for the Remembrance Service. So each November for Remembrance Day, there is the large garrison service and parade for Remembrance Day, and that's at the Royal Garrison Church. At the Royal Garrison Church there are numerous memorials relating to the First World War, the most poignant of which is undoubtedly the Somme Cross. This is a wooden cross that was originally erected on the Somme battlefield at High Wood, and it was erected in December 1916 by the Royal Engineers, 23rd Field Company Royal Engineers, who were the divisional engineers for the 1st Division, one of the two resident Aldershot divisions. And they erected it on the battlefield in memory of their comrades who fell in the Battle of the Somme. After the First World War, the cross was brought back to the UK and erected temporarily outside the 1st Division headquarters here in Aldershot. But being a wooden cross, it was not satisfactory to have it outside. They knew if they left it there, it would eventually rot away in the wind and the weather. So in January 1939, 23 Field Company Royal Engineers, the successors of the men who originally built it, were doing some restoration work at the Royal Garrison Church, and they rebuilt the south porchway. So they moved the Somme Cross into the south porchway, so it was covered from the rain and the weather. So it was preserved, and that whole porchway then was dedicated as the 1st Division Memorial Porchway. So the Somme Cross is a remarkable survivor because it links us directly to the soldiers on the battlefields of the First World War.
Several memorials have been built in remembrance of the war, such as Aldershot Town's First World War Memorial is a cenotaph made of Cornish granite, located in the municipal gardens. The memorial is for the people of Aldershot, who lost their lives in the First World War, and was unveiled on 18th March 1925 by the Duke of Gloucester. There is also a memorial stone marking 100 years since Aldershot soldier Maurice Toy's bravery won him the Victoria Cross by King George V on the Queen's Parade at Aldershot on 8th of June 1918. At the top of Hospital Hill is a tall stone structure memorial to the men of the 2nd Division who died in World War I. Aldershot Military Cemetery is a permanent military MOD site where approximately 692 First World War military personnel lay to rest. The earliest bears the date 5th August 1914, the latest 11th August 1921.
Aldershot enjoys a unique position in British history. It was the first permanent training camp for the Army. For over 100 years, it was the absolute centre for the Army. There were so many developments here. We mentioned earlier the Physical Training Corps, also the Catering Corps was founded here, the military police were founded here. The technological developments, the aviation, but there were also developments in transport that they looked at. So it was the absolute centre for the Army. And it was from here top priority to mobilise Aldershot at the First World War and again the Second World War. Soldiers from Aldershot have gone to every major war from the Crimean War to the present. Soldiers still deploy from here, most recently to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it is not just of local importance, it is of national importance. And the way that the military and the civilian town have interacted is so crucial to understanding the growth of both of them. And you can't separate one from the other. So it's very important, I think, that we preserve the heritage of the military town and the civilian town in tandem, so we can understand how the two have worked together to make Aldershot such a unique and important centre for the Army and for this area. The economy of this area has changed dramatically with the establishment of the camp. And there are presently big changes happening. The Army's footprint has shrunk. The numbers themselves haven't really changed in recent years, but they've given up the land that they no longer needed. So now we have the Wellesley development, this huge development going on across what used to be South Camp. There are, of course, changes happening in the civilian town as well as new housing developments are built. So this is the time where we are looking particularly to preserve what we have of the rich heritage of Aldershot, both military and civilian, and to mark it and to try and promote it so that not just local people but visitors will understand and appreciate the importance and the interest that there is in this area.